Hey everyone, it's Mostly Casual Commander. I'm BK. We're back in Ravnica with Murders at Karlov Manor decks. First up is J-Man playing Voja, Jaws of the Conclave. This get-out-of-hand quickly commander pairs elves and wolves together. Chris is playing Massacre Girl, known killer. He's going to shrink down all of his opponent's creatures and benefit when they die. I'm playing Judith, Carnage, Connoisseur. My plan is to keep the boards clear with death-touchy spells and win by burning down my opponents. And last up we have Kyle playing Anzrag, the Quake Mole. He wants to make this thing indestructible, force blocks, and beat down his opponents. You can follow us on Instagram or Discord, and stick around for an appearance from my fat cat, Meatball. He's so chunky. J-Man kicked us off by playing a Forest and passing over to Chris, who drops a Swamp into a Blood Chief Ascension. If left unanswered, Blood Chief Ascension can do a lot of work draining down his opponents. On my turn, I draw and play a Foreboding Ruins as my land, and I don't reveal anything, so it's just tapped. I pass the turn to Kyle, who plays a Forest into a turn 1 Soul Ring from Warhammer 40k. He passes over to J-Man, who plays a Spire Garden as his land, entering untapped. And with nothing left, he says go. Over to Chris. He drops a Phyrexian Tower as his land. Afterwards, he casts Fume Spitter. If that thing dies, he can put a -1/-1 counter on a thing. It's like it's part of his game plan. On Chris's end step, Kyle taps his Soul Ring for no reason at all. On my turn, I play a Swamp into a Thermo Alchemist, hoping to start pinging my opponents before casting instants and sorceries. I pass a turn over to Kyle, who draws, and he plays a Mountain before casting his commander, Anzrag the Quake Mole, on turn 2. Gotta love Soul Ring, am I right? He passes to J-Man, who draws, plays Sun Petal Grove as his land, and then he casts Springbloom Druid. This will have him sacrifice his forest, and then because he sacked that land, he gets to go and find 2 basic lands, entering the battlefield tapped. He'll find a forest and a plains. On Chris's turn, he misses a land drop, so he starts off by sacrificing his Fume Spitter to his Phyrexian Tower, generating 2 mana in order to cast his Commander Sphere. Then over to me, I play a Mountain as my land, and I follow that up by casting Fiery Inscription. So now whenever I cast an instant or sorcery, it'll deal 2 damage to each of my opponents. It also has the ring Tempt Me, and I don't care about that at all. But nevertheless, I make my Thermo Alchemist my Ring Bearer. I then pass the turn over to Kyle. He draws. He then plays a Forest as his land before casting Bear Umbra on his commander. So not only is it +2/+2, but he'll untap his lands whenever he attacks. He attacks J-Man. His attack trigger happens, he untaps his lands, and J-Man takes 10 whole commander damage on turn 3. Afterwards, Kyle plays Delighted Halfling and says go over to J-Man. He draws, and then he plays Cinderglade as his land. He then decides to ramp even more by casting a very pretty Cultivate. This will have him go find 2 lands. In this case, it's a Forest and a Mountain, and he'll have the Mountain enter the battlefield tapped with the Forest going to his hand. He then passes the turn over to Chris. He plays Spitting Dilophosaurus. So when this ETBs or attacks, he gets to put a -1/-1 counter on something. He chooses Anzrag, rightfully so. He passes, and on his end step, I activate my Thermo Alchemist, pinging each opponent for 1. On my turn, I draw, play a Mountain as my land, then I cast a Timely Soul Ring, but hey, Soul Ring's always good, right? I then activate Thermo Alchemist, once again, pinging each one of my opponents for 1. I then cast Desperate Ritual, generating 3 red mana. This will also untap my Thermo Alchemist and trigger Fiery Inscription, therefore dealing 2 points of damage to each of my opponents. I can cast Judith, Carnage, Connoisseur, thanks to the red mana that I generated. I still have 1 red mana floating as well. And after she's on the battlefield, I activate Thermo Alchemist 1 more time to ping each one of my opponents again, and use my red floating mana to cast End the Festivities. Judith is like, yo, do you want it to be Death Touch and Lifelink? And I say, yes, thank you. So I wipe the board of all creatures. Kyle's commander sticks around because it had Bear Umbra with Totem Armor, but the rest of them die, and I gain some life in the process. It also triggered Fiery Inscription, so my opponents each took 2, and it triggered Thermo Alchemist, so it untaps. I end the turn, and then Chris's Blood Chief Ascension triggers for the 2nd time in the game. On Kyle's turn, he plays Hammer of Nazan. When it ETBs, it'll equip itself right to his commander and give it +2/+0 and indestructible. He attacks me for no reason, and I just take the beats because blocking seems silly. He then passes the turn, and again Chris's Blood Chief Ascension triggers, and it's now online. On J-Man's turn, he plays Rockfall Vale as his land, and then casts Oakheim Adversary, costing 2 less, because somebody owns a green permanent. He passes the turn to Chris. He draws, finally finds another swamp, and then he casts his commander, Massacre Girl, Known Killer. So his creatures will have Wither, and he'll get to draw cards if things die a certain way. On his end step, I activate Thermo Alchemist and ping my opponents. I play me a nice mountain, and then I cast Veto, Thorn of the Dusk Rose. I have some cards that can gain me a bunch of life with Judith's ability, so I'm hoping Veto can put in some work. I smack Kyle with my commander, dropping him to 28 before passing the turn. On his turn, he plays Return of the Wild Speaker, so he'll draw 9 whole cards, given the power of his commander. When Return hits his bin, Bloodchief Ascension will trigger, draining him 2 and gaining Chris 2. Kyle draws 9 whole cards, and he finds a Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth, as his land, and then he casts Spore Frog as well. Look at that cute little guy. He then moves into combat, swinging his commander at me once again. I again take the beats, because blocking seems bad. I can't take another hit like that, though. Then Kyle has to discard on his end step, losing 6 whole life, and Chris gaining 6 life. Chris updates his total in a moment. J-Man plays Rootbound Crag on his turn, and then he moves into combat. He swings his Death Touchy thing at Chris, who just takes the beats, dropping to 31. And J-Man got to draw a card when his creature's triggered ability hit the stack. Then he casts his commander, Voja, Jaws of the Conclave. Voja can get out of hand real quick. On Chris's turn, he plays Gruesome Realization. He chooses the first mode and has himself draw 2 cards and lose 2 life. From among them, he found another swamp that he desperately needs. He plays it, and then he passes the turn. On his end step, I again activate my Thermo Alchemist, pinging all of my opponents. Then I draw, and then I move right into the red zone, swinging my Judith at Kyle's face, dropping him to 16. I pass the turn, he plays Crag Crown Pathway, and then he casts Escape to the Wilds. He'll exile the top 5 cards of his library, gets to play an additional land, and loses some life whenever Escape hit his bin. Kyle goes on to exile the top 5 cards of his library, and from among them decides to play a Cinder Glade as his land for turn, and then he casts Jeska, Thrice Reborn. Most notably here is Jeska's Zero ability, which Kyle activates in order to make it so that Anzrag would deal triple the amount of damage to an opponent. Kyle then attacks me once again with Anzrag. Before blocks, I cast Big Score, discarding an additional card, therefore losing 4 life because of Chris's Bloodchief Ascension. I activated my Thermo Alchemist, pinging my opponents for 1, and then Fiery Inscription also triggered, dealing 2 more points of damage to all of my opponents. And finally, I have Judith's triggered ability Resolve, therefore making me a 2/2 Imp creature token, and I name her Deborah. My Thermo Alchemist untaps, and of course Big Score allowed me to generate 2 treasure tokens as well as draw 2 cards. And sadly, those 2 cards I drew are no help. Therefore, I chump block Anzrag with Deborah. When she dies, it'll deal 2 damage to each one of my opponents and trigger Chris's Bloodchief Ascension, draining me 2 and gaining him 2. Most importantly, it untaps Kyle's commander and there's another attack phase. He attacks me again. I declare blocks with Thermo Alchemist and ping all of my opponents by activating him before he dies. Again, this triggers Bloodchief Ascension, draining 2, gaining 2. Kyle attacks once again. I block with Veto. Bloodchief Ascension once again triggers, draining and gaining, and we update our life totals accordingly. Anzrag untapped, and once again, Kyle moves to combat. This time, the path is clear, so he smashes Anzrag into my face, knocking me out of the game. I hope you're happy about Deborah, Kyle. On his end step, J-Man casts Chaos Warp on his Spore Frog. He's got a play in mind. Kyle has that resolve, as opposed to cracking Spore Frog and taking 2 from Bloodchief. Bloodchief does trigger, though, when Chaos Warp hits J-Man's bin, so he loses 2 and Chris gains 2. Kyle reveals the top card of his library, and it is not a permanent, therefore it stays on top. Onto J-Man's turn proper, he draws, and then he plays another mountain as his land for turn before casting Fiery Emancipation. This thing will have J-Man's permanents deal 3 times the amount of damage that they normally would. J-Man moves to combat, swinging Voja at Kyle and his Oakhame adversary at Chris. On the attack, Voja triggers, getting a +1/+1 counter on both of those things and drawing him a card. Before blocks, Chris casts Undying Malice on his commander, which will have it re-enter the battlefield should it die. He then blocks the Oakhame adversary, killing it dead with Wither, therefore drawing a card, and Massacre Girl comes back out onto the battlefield. Sadly, Kyle was knocked out of the game in this interaction. Another drain 2 and gain 2 from Bloodchief Ascension, and onto Chris's turn, he plays a Swamp, and then he just says go over to J-Man. He plays a forest as his land before casting Tolsimir, Friend to Wolves. When that ETBs, the small Voja trigger hits the stack, and in response to that, Chris decides to cast Dismember using some of his life for Phyrexian mana. This will shrink down Tolsimir before Voja even enters the battlefield. It gets shrunk -5/-5, therefore triggering Massacre Girl, drawing Chris a card. Then, when Voja enters the battlefield, it doesn't fight anything anymore. J-Man then casts Unnatural Growth, still in his first main phase. J-Man then moves to combat with Big Voja, attacking Chris. On the attack, it triggers, and in response to the trigger, Chris casts Whisper of the Dross, targeting Big Voja, paying the ward cost, shrinking it by 1, and proliferating Massacre Girl's +1 counter. J-Man's trigger resolves, he gets to draw 2. Chris then blocks Big Voja with his commander. Big Voja is currently a 10/10, so it has to assign 6 points of its damage to Massacre Girl and 4 over the top with its trample. Then Fiery Emancipation triples each one of those figures. So Chris takes 12 points of commander damage. Because Massacre Girl had Wither, Voja had -4/-4, plus the -1/-1 from earlier. So it dies on its end step when all of those things clean up. On Chris's turn, he plays another Swamp. Then he floats a mana with Commander Sphere and cracks it to draw a card. He then casts Black Sun's Twilight, where X equals 5. So he'll shrink down Little Voja, as well as reanimate Spitting Dilophosaurus. Little Voja touches the graveyard, even though it's a token, so it triggers Bloodchief Ascension, draining J-Man 2 and Chris gaining 2 more life as well. After that, Chris passes the turn. J-Man draws and plays Moonblessed Cleric. This will have him go and find an enchantment card. Reveal it, he finds an Aura Shards. So after he shuffles up, he'll put it on top of his library. He drops Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth, as his land for turn. Then he casts, following that, he recasts his commander and wishes that he had some sort of haste enabler. Sadly, he has to pass the turn. On Chris's turn, he plays an Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, making all of his swamps into more swamps. He casts Phyrexian Arena, and then he says go, back to J-Man. On J-Man's turn, he draws that Aura Shards, and immediately plays said Aura Shards. He would normally never do this, but he follows it up by casting an Anger from his hand. And it hits the battlefield, triggering Aura Shards, therefore allowing him to finally blow up that pesky Bloodchief Ascension. J-Man states he wants to move into combat, but before they move into that phase, Chris casts Sudden Spoiling. So, J-Man's creatures become O2s and lose all of their abilities. J-Man forgoes his combat and says, I'll just play a Stomping Ground. J-Man also had a Wilderness Reclamation in his hand, so he drops that onto his battlefield, therefore untapping all of his lands on each end step. J-Man passes, Chris draws from Phyrexian Arena, losing 1, and draws Proper before playing Massacre Worm. This shrinks all of J-Man's creatures -2/-2, and whenever an opponent's creature dies, it drains them 2 life. So, J-Man loses 2 creatures and loses 4 total life. Chris then sees a line, plays a Swamp, moves into combat with his Spitting Dilophosaurus. On the attack, its ability triggers, throwing out a -1/-1 counter. He uses his Phyrexian Tower and the Swamp to pay for the ward cost on Voja, giving it a -1/-1 counter, and Spitting Dilophosaurus can't be blocked by creatures with -1 counters on him. He deals enough damage to knock J-Man out of the game. Congratulations, Chris, job well done. Sacking a Massacre Worm to Phyrexian Tower did the trick. And as promised, here's Meatball. He's so chunky. I'd also like to give a huge shout out to all of our Patreon subscribers. Your support truly goes a long way to help make this possible. If there's other viewers out there that would like to contribute on Patreon, you can do so by visiting patreon.com/mostlycasualcommander and contributing as little as $1 a month. And for all the other unsubscribed viewers out there, we'd truly appreciate it if you subscribed, liked the content you've been enjoying, and as always, thank you for watching.